Elder abuse is a fact. It goes on more than you think. Elder Abuse Awareness Day is June 15. To find out more, I'm joined by Sarah Earle, a registered psychotherapist. So, Sarah, tell me, define elder abuse for me.
So elder abuse takes many different forms. So usually what we see is either physical, sexual, financial, or neglect. Those are kind of the top four. And the definition of any kind of abuse is something happening to somebody that is against their will from a person that is in a position of power and control. So it's a fairly broad definition, Donna, and it really depends on the person who is the victim saying that it is feeling like abuse. So one of the most important pieces with this, I think, is to allow the person who's experiencing it to define what feels abusive to them.
What form of abuse gets the most complaints? What do you hear about the most?
The most, the one that we hear about the most, but it's not, I wouldn't say like it's far and ahead of the really, one that gets way, way more, but we actually hear about psychological abuse the most. So if you think about kind of prevalence in Canada, the stat for psychological abuse is 2.2%, and the other forms of abuse are about 1.5%. So that's kind of the difference. But if you look at amount of Canadians, so that are experiencing psychological abuse who are elderly, that's 207,000 Canadians. So that's a lot of people. And that's the one that we hear about the most, and that also gets the least attention because you can't see it, right? So that would include emotional, spiritual, verbal put downs, things like that. Those are the ones that we hear about the most. And I think, once again, I think it's because it's hard to see, so people have a hard time believing it's going on.
Or is it possible that someone who is being victimized with psychological abuse doesn't see it as abuse?
It's interesting that you say that, Donna, because I think, we look at elder abuse as a specific type of abuse. But the really big difference between elder abuse and any other kind of abuse is that the elderly population doesn't receive the kind of attention when they're going through abuse that other populations receive, which is really a shame, and certainly a larger topic. But yes, absolutely. And even when an elderly person is experiencing something like physical abuse or neglect, there is a population of elderly people that isn't as visible to the community. So, even when that's happening, it's hard to believe. But then, when we look at sort of the generation or the chronology of people that are in the group or of elderly people right now, there's a lot of being taught about being tough and not complaining and having gratitude for what you're given. And so a lot of, some of the values and messages that some of the people in the elderly population would have grown up with also stops people from complaining, right? So yes, absolutely. They may not define it as abuse, and they may not have words to even put into it to tell somebody.
So then how do these complaints come to your attention?
Well, there's a few different ways. Often, the way we hear complaints is we'll have a client who comes in for a completely unrelated issue, and the counselor that's working with them, or the psychotherapist who's working with them, will help them to define it as abuse. So I've had clients in the past who came in and were sort of talking about, having a nephew that was hanging around their house a lot and taking things from their home, asking for money all the time. And she was sort of saying, well, he has a really hard time though, and the poor guy, like, he just can't catch a break, and he can't keep a job. And sort of as we were going through that, I was kind of cluing into it, but she was just sort of saying, well, this is my poor nephew, right? So I think it's the people around the person who's being abused that is noticing it. Couple of reasons for that are, number one, that abuse doesn't happen overnight. If somebody went from not being abusive to you at all to being physically harmful to you the next day, people would notice it right away, or notice it more often. But that's not usually the chronology of abuse. Abuse is gradual. So That's one of the things that stops it from being prevalent and coming out. And then the other piece is that, a lot of people have had really interesting experiences in their life, and this may actually not be the worst thing that they're experiencing. So usually the way it comes out is they're talking to somebody else and somebody else says, that doesn't sound right, or I don't think you should be going through that. So that's the biggest way we hear about it.
You know, I'm just thinking, it sounds like it's often family members who are the abusers.
Often,
And,
yeah.
and I'm thinking, if I ever spoke to my mother that way, well, I won't say I didn't. I might have done it once and then learned that no, that wasn't going to work. I can't imagine her putting up with it, and I can't imagine myself even trying it. So, what happens that makes it so it's okay? Like what went on in the background, or does this only just kick in when their children become adults and they become elderly?
No, I think that that's a really good question, because I think that there has to be, in my experience, there has to be some kind of history. Like, this doesn't just come out of nowhere. And I think one of the biggest things that we see with abuse is that there is a level of dependence on the person who is being abusive. So if you're dependent on that person, and if you have been dependent, so one of the scenarios that we see that is fairly common is an elderly person, and it's more women than men who are abused, but not, men are obviously abused as well. But we'll see an elderly person whose partner is deceased, and they are relying on an adult child, for example, to look after them. And they may have had a relationship for 50 years with somebody who took care of everything, finances, going out to work. That may have been the model for them. And so their level of dependence on somebody else has been sort of groomed or formed over many, many years. So the dependence piece is a place where abuse enters quite frequently. So if you're dependent on somebody for financial management because you've never written a check before, or if you have a physical disability of some kind, that's where we see abuse happening the most, because there's always that fear that if I say something or if I complain, who's going to look after me? Where am I going to end up? And so that's one of the biggest ones, I think, is that there's a history of being dependent, and then that sort of translates into maybe they were dependent or working, with a person that they could rely on in the past, but maybe their current person that's looking after them isn't doing as good of a job or isn't as reliable. But there's always family dynamics. This can be such a long conversation about the dynamics that go into abuse. Absolutely. There is usually some kind of history.
I would think so, just thinking about that. A couple of weeks ago, the military came out with a report, and it's because they had been dispatched to some of nursing homes. And the report was chilling, disturbing, and I think anybody who heard or read about it was disturbed. So, is that's elder abuse? I mean, there's no getting around that. Is that something you folks are involved in?
We actually work more at the organizational level with long-term care homes. And so we don't work as directly. Well, I shouldn't say that, actually. So we do actually have a social worker that works in one of the long-term care homes in Kingston, and actually helped me kind of prepare for this interview, because she's been working with the long-term care home, and they're doing a wonderful job with making sure that elderly in their home are doing well. But we work kind of at the organizational level with staff. And so this is just in general. We're not working with the home where the military made the report. But what I can tell you, Donna, is working with staff at the organizational level, this is not a new issue. This is an issue that, and I don't mean abuse, I mean staffing issues and people being burnt out and working 24-hour shifts. And this has been an issue it's come to light, but the fact that long-term care homes are understaffed and struggling, and I think my fear working at the organizational level is that this makes people who have actually been working really, really hard, um, they're taking the fall for a systemic issue that's been going on for a really, really long time. So in our organization, that's the level we see it at. But certainly, I mean, in a long-term care home, I think oversight is the most important thing, because that's where you have the chance. Like, these, there's a lot of people who are fairly isolated, physically can't do very much. They're dependent on other people. So you have all of these factors that really do contribute to abuse. So it makes sense that that's somewhere that you have to be really, really careful, because if you do get people who have a tendency towards abuse, that's a really that is absolutely where it could happen for sure.
Now, I want to ask for some personal advice. I turned 70 last winter.
Ah,
And
happy
yeah,
birthday.
thank you. And frankly, this is the best time of my life. But what can I do to avoid being that person who comes to your attention and you have to gently say, dear, you're being abused? What can I do to avoid having that happen to me?
Oh, it's excellent question. So one of the biggest things that we work with the elderly population around is not becoming isolated. And so, in Kingston, pre-pandemic, we have a really good senior center that really connects people in with some nice activities and groups. And so one of the best things that you can do, Donna, is make sure that you're maintaining contact with lots of family members and friends, and not just one person, that you're not reliant on one person. Couple of reasons for that. Number one, people are going to notice then, right? Somebody is going to see it. But also, you are not going to feel like you're in a position where you're reliant on one person and therefore you can't say anything because that's the only person you have. So I think in psychotherapy in general, we spend a lot of time advising people to make sure that they don't become isolated, because that's not who we're meant to be. And I think the other thing is you have to know what the signs are, right? So if you're an outgoing person and you're starting to feel really withdrawn, if you are blaming yourself for the abuse, thinking like, if I only did things differently, then that's definitely a sign. It can't always be you, right? There's always two people in this. So um, if you are being left alone for long periods of time and you're dependent on somebody else, that's a really big one. If your hygiene needs, like if we're talking basic needs, if you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from, or you are having a hard time with your own personal hygiene and nobody's helping you or not helping you enough, those are signs. And the other big one is the financial one. If you have a shared account with somebody like a power of attorney or something like that, and your account is being drained or you're not understanding your finances, and they're not sharing that with you, that's a sign as well. So those are some really key ones that we look out for.
And this is coming from someone who is just a cranky old lady, but I'm going to say to people out there, elders, stop being so damn nice. We're afraid to say no. We're taught to be nice, and it could come back and bite you. And I think that happens. That they're just afraid of offending somebody, and there's a lot to be said for being a cranky old lady.
And I think that there's a lot of gray in between that too, right? I think that it's really okay to be assertive. Like, you have the right to have a happy life. Like, there's some really basic things that we talk to people about. You have the right to happiness. You have the right to food and lodgings and warmth and affection. Those are really, really basic human needs. If you are living day to day and any of those is not available to you readily in Canada, there's something going on that's not okay, and you have the right to that. That is a personal right, that is a legislated right. So it's not even about being nice, it's just about, like, that's a pretty low bar, and if that's not being met, then I think that there's something to be really aware of there. Absolutely.
This has been so interesting. I have learned a lot. I do appreciate your time, and well, stay safe out there.
Yes, you too, Donna. Thank you for giving us the time today.